I begin with poetry. It was some years ago that our beloved Maya Angelou looked into the face of America at the installation of another president and said, "Lift up your eyes upon this day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it, this dream, into the palms of your hands. Mold it into the image of your most public self. Sculpt it into the shape of your most private need. Here on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face and say simply, very simply with hope, good morning." Give her a round of applause for poetry. It was William Carlos Williams who said, "It's difficult to find news in poetry, and yet men die miserably every day because of what's found there." I talk to you today about hope, The fact is that I'm on a campus that has students from over 100 countries, and right now everybody's excited. We almost got one of those ESPYs last night. Give my team a round of applause for beating UVA. Big round of applause. But here's what's significant about that. We are a nerdy campus that were the national cyber champions last year, and my basketball team reads well. Give me a big round of applause for reading well and getting good jobs. More important than that. And my message to you today is that the way we think about ourselves as a society, as a party, the language that we use, the way we interact with each other, the values that we hold will be so important. People will know us by what we love. We become like that which is most important to you. I want you to think for a minute about what we say to young people when they ask you, when they ask me on my campus, why should we have hope? The fact is that our parents told us that telling the truth was important, that it's important to be honest, to have integrity. It's important to respect women. It's important to believe that our children have a right to an education. And yet we see people at the highest of levels in our society not seeming to have those same values. Where is the hope? It's never been this bad before, Doc. I hear that all the time from people from all kinds of backgrounds, from all parties. And what's interesting is they look at me as they look at you, as young people look at us to say, who are we as a country, as a society? You know, I often say the only way we can understand who we are today and who we might become is to understand the history, the context. How did we get to where we are? Everyone is talking about that. And I would argue that people who are determined to succeed bring both the analysis, the analytics, of course, but also they bring great passion to the work. And that's what I want you to think about, this notion of the head and the heart. And so I begin with first Aristotle, who said, "Excellence is never an accident. It is the result of high intention, sincere effort, and intelligent execution. It represents the wisest choice of all the alternatives." And then he said something that gives me goosebumps. He said, "Choice, not chance, determines your destiny." Choice, not chance, determines your destiny. I choose hope. When my students say to me, "It's never been that bad before," I look at them and I say, "Let's go back and read some history." I tell them, "Let's go and see the play in New York on Hamilton. Let's see how Mr. Hamilton was killed by another forefather. That there was a time when congressmen were beating each other with canes." And so it's too easy to say, "Oh, it's not like the good old days." Because for some of us, they were not the good old days. And so I begin with what happened in the 60s and my own stories. I challenge you as you choose hope, as we work to build hope among people, our children, our families, that you tell your stories. Stories inspire. I am a mathematician, by the way. I get goosebumps doing math. When I was in school, if the teacher gave us 10 problems, I'd say, "Give us 10 more, teacher," and the whole class would go, "Shut up, Freeman," because most people really don't like math. And yet what I tell you today is that the stories that I developed as a child shape who I am today. And there are two stories that shape my thinking about the world, my thinking about education. And I would argue that each of you is a leader and each of you is an educator. You can never not lead. My mama, the English teacher, would say that would be called a double negative. Never not lead means you're always leading in your language, in your body language, in the way you treat people, in the way you interact, in the courage you have or don't have. We are leading all the time. And so I began with the story of my mother, a little girl of color, little black girl in a country town, Wetumpka, Alabama. I am from the big city, Birmingham. I grew up in Birmingham. I now live in Baltimore at UMBC Research University. Baltimore is what I call the Upper South. The Upper South. One day we think like Philadelphia, the next day like Richmond, right? But when you're from Birmingham, you know you're really from the South. And we Southerners love stories. How many of you saw Steel Magnolias with Dolly Parton? Remember that one? Remember at one point, it was a great movie, and all of a sudden, somebody's in the beauty parlor and telling all these great lies, and the beauticians are looking at each other, and as the person leaves, Dolly looks at the audience and says, there's a story there. Because we always the products of our stories. And so my mother had the choice of either working in a hot cotton field or working in a wealthy home, a wealthy white home. And she wanted to see how rich people lived. And the distinguishing quality of that home was that there was a library and the people used it a lot. And the woman was kind enough to say, Maggie, when you finish your work, you can go into the library and read. And mother would do just that. And then she'd say, take the book home. And when you get finished, let's have you write a piece for me and let's talk about it. And when she would go home with a book, at a time when there was no library for children of color, and the only library, quite frankly, even in the school was so limited, and the only book in our home, a wonderful book, the Bible, that when she would go home with a book, her girlfriends would say, why do you want to read that book? This is not school time. And it was then that she began to understand this difference between herself and her girlfriends, this change that was occurring. And here was the change. It is at the heart of my thinking about the education of our children and where we are as a society. She said the more she read, the better a reader she became. And the more proficient a reader she became, the more she enjoyed the experience. And the more she enjoyed reading, the more reading she did. And then she learned to write and to think, and she began to see how language transforms people. And people would say, that's a special little girl. And the woman would talk to her about ideas. And it was at that point she knew exactly what she wanted to do for the rest of her life, to become a teacher of English. And so this poor little colored girl in Wetumpka went on to have a career, 40-some years, teaching English and giving people this sense of power that comes when you can grasp ideas and you can think critically, and you can express yourself with clarity. It makes all the difference in the world. One of our challenges as leaders, as educators, as people in a party, as people who are known to be successful, is that we must develop the language that is so powerful and yet so simple and clear that people who may not have had the benefits that we've had would say, yeah, that makes sense. You know, I chair the Marguerite Casey Foundation in Seattle. Very privileged to be with a wonderful group. And we focus on poor children and families around the country. Poor children and families of all races, children of color, from New Mexico to Alabama to wherever. And we have a big initiative with thousands of families called Equal Voice Action. And our philosophy is ALA, ask, listen, act. The worst thing a foundation can do, the worst thing any group of leaders can do of educated people is to go in telling people what they need. It is so important that we listen to what people say. But when we have listened carefully to all of these people from low-income backgrounds, of every background, immigrants and blacks and whites and whatever, they all say the same things that you were just hearing from John, that everybody wants their children to get an education. Everybody wants a good job. Everybody wants to be able to take care of their families. They want to know that their kids are going to be okay. It is a fundamental part of the human experience. It really is. And so as I talk about stories, I want you to keep in mind the last 50 years. I was sitting in the back of church and not wanting to be there in the middle of the week. What kid wants to be in church in the middle of the week? In Birmingham. And my parents asked me to listen to this speaker at the lectern. And the man said, if the children participate in this peaceful protest, 1963, all of America will understand that even our babies know the difference between right and wrong. And then he said something that just took I was sitting there doing the two things I love most, math and eating. I was getting fatter and smarter all the time. We Southerners like those cheeks. And I was eating M&Ms, the good kind with the peanuts. You know the kind, right? And all of a sudden he said, and if the children participate, they'll be able to go to better schools. Now, we had some wonderful teachers who were limited because of resources, but what always bothered me so much was that we were given what we call the hand-me-down books. Just 50 years ago, any book I was getting was from a white school after they finished with it. This is just 50 years ago. Brown paper bags around there. And my parents were not allowed to buy my books because then I'd be different from other children. So we were all being told we were not as good as the other children. And so when he said, we need them to march and say, we don't like this, I said, I've got to go. I went home and I said, I've got to move. And who was he? What was his name? Of course, Dr. Martin Luther King. And I went home and my parents said, absolutely not. You cannot do this. And I said to them, you guys made me go. I did not want to go. You told me to listen. I kind of listened. And now you tell me I can't do what he asked? You are hypocrites. And at that time, you did not tell your parents they were hypocrites. Go to your room, boy. And I knew the next morning when they came in, they were going to punish me. But my dad, and they had been praying all night. And they said this. They said, it wasn't that we didn't trust you. We did not trust the people who would be over you, because if you march in downtown Birmingham for your freedom to get a better education, you will be placed in jail. And there were the dogs and the fire hoses. But I knew I wanted a better education. And they said, if you want to do this, we put you in God's hands. And they were courageous enough to let me go. My students said, oh, you must have been really courageous. No, I was not courageous. The only thing I'd ever attacked in my life was a math problem. Get that point, all right? But I did know I wanted a better education. I did go, and in the middle of the week, as all these children were being treated like animals, without enough space, without enough bathrooms, with children as young as 8, with the stench, all of it, there was Dr. King with all of our parents outside saying, what you children do this day will have an impact on children of all races who've not even been born. And somehow we sensed the profundity of that prophecy. And quickly you had the civil rights action because of the March on Washington, and you had the 1964 Act and the 1965 Act and voting rights and in higher education, and all of a sudden things changed. Let me prove it to you in a fundamental way. What percent of Americans do you think in 1965 had graduated from college? What would you think? Let me hear from you. And don't let me say you're risk adverse, because if you're risk adverse, you're never going to win anything. You got to be able to take a chance, right? What percent of Americans in 1965 do you believe at age 25 or older had graduated from college? 25%? 35%? It was only 10%. Now, we broke it down at those times by black and white. You know that, right? In fact, let me prove that to you. How many of you remember black and white TV? You look good. My students were, what do you mean? TV was always in color. No, it was not. But then everything was broken down into black people and white people in the Census Bureau. And so what percent, if 10% of all Americans, what percent do you think of white Americans that graduated from college? What do you think? 45%? 35%? It was only 11%. And for blacks, what do you think? It was maybe 2%. Graduates of the HBCUs in the South, right? So you put it together, literally, most Americans in the mid-60s never thought their children would go to college of any race. Now, how many of you in this room are either first in your family or first generation to go to college? Stand up. Let me see who you are. Stand up if you were first in your family or the first generation to go to college. Give them a round of applause. Keep standing. Keep standing. Keep standing. Okay, watch this. How many of you are either second generation to go to college? Let me see you stand. Stand up. Keep standing. Keep standing. Look around the room. Now give America a round of applause. So you must tell your story to let people know, have a seat, that this is a new occurrence. In the 60s, most women did not have opportunities for jobs still. Blacks and Hispanics, quite frankly, were not getting a chance to go to college like other people. And yet all of a sudden we began this evolution. And then the first person goes to college, and what happens? The next kid goes to college. And the cousins want to go to college. And you go to church and they tell you, or synagogue, when they say this, they say, he's going to college. And people give you $5. Or $10 and say, we're proud of you, baby, right? And others say, she ought to be getting the job right now. You got the naysayers also, right? But people saw that when you get the education, education transforms lives. And so here we are today, and you heard John saying half the people go to college and yet they don't succeed. Well, today what we must say is this. We should have post-secondary opportunities, number one. That college, the traditional college, is not for everybody at 18. I have too many kids telling me, I'm bored in school. But we must have opportunities for them of different types. And I would argue that the more we help people understand that being involved, being an activist, getting involved in voting leads to laws and policies that change lives. There's a connection there that is not readily apparent. But all you have to do is go back to the 60s, and you see how we marched, and we had all kinds of conditions, and we ended up with some legislation and some acts, and all of a sudden policies and Pell Grant, and then all of a sudden Americans realized maybe my kid can go to college. And so today we have 30% with a college degree. What percent of whites, do you think, with a college degree? 4-year degree. What percent? 40. It's about 37%. What percent of blacks? It's about 20%. What's the fastest growing group in our country? Latinx, right? Latinx, right? Hispanic, right? What percent? It's only 14 to 15%. What percent of Asian Americans? It's about, I heard somebody say 80. It's only 55%, right? I know that. Thank you for your courage. Most people think it's politically incorrect. About a third of my students are from Asian countries. And one of the advantages they have is that many people come here to grad school from Asian countries. That makes a difference. And then what percent of Native Americans? Well below the Hispanics, okay? So what is my point? Today, when you put it all together, still, 2/3 of Americans have not had anyone in their families graduate from college. Now, when I say that to my friends of every race, they would say, that couldn't be true. Everybody I know has a college degree. Duh. Lawyers know lawyers. Doctors know doctors, right? And plumbers know plumbers. Give the plumbers a round of applause. There's another one. Give the plumbers a round. It's some wonderful, and I heard him saying it, we must change the way we think about work. We must understand there's great dignity in work, but we need to pay people for the different kinds of jobs. One of the things we've done, there's several things I want to mention very quickly that you'll appreciate at UMBC. It is a place where half the students are in STEM. We have become the leading university in the country. We've now produced more African Americans, not just in a predominantly white setting, because we're about 50-50 minority majority, but we have produced more African Americans who've gone on to complete MD PhDs than any university in the history of America. Give us a big round of applause for physician scientists. But we must think about the critical issues from the fact that we've got a 50% decline in women in technology. All these jobs require technology. In the 80s, there were 36% of the majors in computer science were women. Today, it's under 20%. We must be appalled by that idea. The most exciting program on my campus this summer involves girls coding and yoga. Did you get that? And you know who funds it? The National Security Agency. Because the yoga helps with the stamina and confidence, and you learn to do by doing. We must come up with all of these practices and approaches and policies that would increase the number of girls who are in technology, for example, of people of color in science and tech, of low-income students who succeed, since under 20% of those in the bottom quarter are succeeding right now. And at the heart of it, yeah, the financial issue and Pell Grant we need to look at, but the reading skills. If you give me a child who can read well, I can teach her to solve math problems. And so we must emphasize the reading and the thinking and believing in these people. The hard work is important. You know, the name of our mascot is True Grit, our Chesapeake Bay Retriever. True Grit. We say that UMBC is the house of grit. Nothing takes the place of hard work, of resilience, of perseverance. And so I end with stories about voting. My grandmama was the wisest woman I ever knew, lived in Wetumpka, was determined to become a voter in the early 60s. And we had in that state something called the Alabama Literacy Test. While whites could come up and do an X for their names, blacks had to pass this test. The test was based on the Constitution. She took the test the first time, she didn't pass it. It was clear to her the questions were really hard from the Constitution. She had my mama, the English teacher, working with her, trying to help her to understand more about the fundamentals of the Constitution. And what she did was this. She had some of her friends memorize some questions. When they had failed it, memorize different parts of the test. And then this brilliant 6th grade woman, educated woman, had the confidence to get them to put those questions together and then to practice with people. And so when she took that test the 3rd time, she came back from Wetumpka to Birmingham. She walked in the door, and I will never forget her face. She looked at me and she said, I am now a voting first-class citizen of my country. She was 70 years old. I tell my students, how dare you not vote? How dare you not vote? Give me a big round of applause for that, because people need to know people have died so that we women and people of color and can have that vote. This is not about business as usual. We must bring that passion to it to make the point that nothing takes the place of believing in what we're saying. And so I challenge you to watch your thoughts. They become your words. Watch your words. They become your actions. Watch your actions, they become your habits. Watch your habits, they become your character. I tell my students your character has everything to do with what you will do when you don't think anybody can see you, when your mama's not there. So thoughts become words. Words become actions. Actions become habits. Habits become character. Watch your character. It becomes your destiny. Dreams and values. I choose hope. Thank you all very much. Thank you.